everyone, this is Mrs. Warham and my cameraman Matthew, as well as my little cherub Christopher. Today we are going to continue our story, Flat Stanley, His Original Adventure by Jeff Brown. We are on Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is Stanley the Kite. Wonder what that might mean. Let's read. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum, roller skating in the park, but it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind being carried because he never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. One Sunday afternoon in the street, they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop.
Well, George, I see you have bought some wallpaper, Mr. Jones said. Going to decorate your house, I suppose?
Wallpaper? Said Mr. Lambchop. Oh, no. This is my son, Stanley. He undid the string and Stanley unrolled.
How do you do?
Stanley asked.
Nice to meet you, young feller, the man said.
George, he said to Mr. Lambchop, that boy is flat. Smart, too, Mr. Lambchop said. Stanley is third from the top of his class at school. Phoo-wee, said Arthur. This is my younger son, Arthur, said Mr. Lambchop. And he will apologize for his rudeness. Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on their way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur laying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of encyclopedias on top of himself. Put some more on, Arthur said. Why do you think Arthur wants all these encyclopedias on himself? Let's take a look at this picture. What would this purpose do for Arthur? What is he trying to do? If you said get flat, I think you're onto something. Don't just stand there, help me. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed. But the next morning they woke to Stanley. Arthur can't help but being jealous, they said. Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all. And then next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny and windy too. Many older brothers were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails made in all different colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. Someday, he said, I will have a kite, a big kite, and I will win a kite flying contest and be famous. Like everyone else, nobody knows who I am these days. Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. You can fly me, Arthur said. Come on. He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, 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 up went Stanley, like being a kite. He knew how to just manage on the gust of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from behind when he wanted to speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind carefully and a little at a time so it did not hold him. And then he would slip gracefully down toward earth again. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in the red shirt and a blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then swooped left in long, matched swoops. He held his arms by his side and zoomed like a rocket and curled up toward the sun. He sighed, slipped, and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown that way that Stanley Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one will ever again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedge in the fork of a tree. He did not notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind had been blowing the string and tangling it up in the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until the leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He was stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and all the boys heard the cries and climbed up to set him free. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still crossed. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day having fun," she said. "You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "Phases. Be patient, dear." And that is the conclusion, 3rd grade, of Chapter 3. The next chapter is called The Museum Thieves. In the meantime, think about what that might mean. Until next time, see you later.